talked a lot yesterday about Sir Keir Starmer and his comments about banning protests outside schools. Of course, we got him to talk about the Batley Grammar School, which I'm very proud. But there was one of the comments from Sir Keir that I want to focus on now, and it's this, because with the country drowning in around £2.7 trillion of national debt, the Labour leader warned those in Dudley that there's no magic money tree. Well, I'm joined now in our studio by our political correspondent, Katherine Forster. Katherine, Sir Keir on the election trail, a soft election trail in Dudley, but if councillors there are expecting a Maundy Thursday money handout, severely disappointed. Is this reality bites time? Now, we are massively in debt, and whatever people think about the party, the country being transformed by a Labour government, the biscuit tin is simply empty.
Yes, I think it is reality biting. And as Labour said to the Conservatives back in 2010, sorry, there's no money left. And we're in pretty much a similar situation now with a potential incoming Labour government. So although voters seem to be absolutely fed up to the back teeth after the Conservatives ruling and taxes at a 70-year high, public service is not in a good place, it's clear that no matter who is in charge after the next election, there isn't a lot of money. We've got a massive national debt, as you say, and turning the economy round, creating the factors for growth, etc., takes time. So anybody who thinks that voting in Labour, Sir Keir Starmer, that suddenly they'll be able to get a doctor's appointment, that taxes will fall, that we'll get growth, is in for a big disappointment. It's going to be very, very difficult for whatever colour of party is in power after the next election. And
talking of which, there could be a third colour in this race, the Reform Party. Some staggering polling out today. A major headache for Rishi Sunak is growing, not only the nationwide polling of 14%, but when you dive into the detail, Katherine, there's a real problem for Rishi Sunak amongst the working class voters. Yeah, dreadful news for Rishi Sunak. It feels like all the news for Rishi Sunak is bad these days. So working class voters are now more likely to vote for Reform than the Conservatives. Northern voters more likely to vote for Reform, men more likely to vote for Reform. And of the people who voted Conservative in 2019, only about half of them are planning to do so again. And a huge third of them are planning to go straight to Reform. Only about 12% thinking of going across to Labour. But of course, Reform is probably not going to get many or maybe any seats, but they're likely to stop the Tories getting a whole load of seats that they might otherwise have won. And this really could be an existential crisis for the Conservative Party. Midlands, working class, white men. It's almost like Lee Anderson personified. I wonder how much of Lee crossing the floor to Reform has given them this boost. And what about the big one? There's talk in the press today of attempts to neutralise Nigel. Because if that man were to come back, when I say neutralise, offer him a peerage, offer him an ambassador's job, they're scrambling around with a Nigel-shaped problem, and they seem like headless chickens. They're very worried, and there's a leaked recording of Danny Kruger from the New Conservatives saying, you know, how devastating Reform could be for them, and saying that he was sympathetic to their sort of diagnosis of the problem, that the Conservatives weren't conservative enough, though he did say, you know, that they were Reform out to destroy the Conservatives. And of course, they're doing very well as it is. If Nigel Farage comes from his sort of semi-hands-off role as chair, comes back and leads the party, then inevitably they're going to go higher in the polls. So yes, some suggestions that they could potentially buy him off effectively, give him UK ambassador, to the United States, especially given he's clearly got an incredibly good relationship with Donald Trump, who may well be president come November. So, the Conservatives must think they just cannot seem to catch a break at the moment. And it just feels like things are going from bad to worse
to even worse.
Something else, I know you were very involved in this story. Angela Rayner, of course, here's another story that just won't go away. There's a whiff of badness around it, around the council house past. You just told me a story about when she first spoke about this in the Commons. You got some insight into her mind.
Well, it was a couple of weeks ago, because this story has been rumbling around, as you say, for weeks. It's a bit technical, but basically she says she doesn't. She says she's had all the correct advice. But some estimates that she might owe about £1,500 in capital gains tax. And the first time she had to speak to journalists about this was a couple of weeks ago at a press gallery lunch in Westminster. She was asked repeatedly about this. And what struck me was not so much the words she used, but the words that she didn't. And also she got really quite emotional, because we think of her as being very sort of take no prisoners, straight talking, very feisty, which she is. But she was really quite emotional. She was almost in tears at one point, I would say. And she was saying, look, I was a care worker. My son was born very prematurely. He's registered blind. I have another son, a teenager. My brother was also helping me. He had his own struggles. He'd served in the armed forces, and a real outpouring of very, very personal, quite embarrassing. It felt to me, I think to other journalists there, quite embarrassing. But her basic message was, back off, give me some privacy. I've done nothing wrong. But the problem is, she can say that till the cows come home, but unless she's going to explain why there was no capital gains tax paid on the house that she owned when she appeared to live largely in another house, I don't think these questions are going to go away. Now, maybe she had the house that she sold, which was her home, as her main residence. There's nothing illegal about that. But she and her husband combined, you can only have one main residence between you. And so these questions have still not been answered. And so I think they will carry on being asked, despite the fact she clearly doesn't like it.
Do you think this is a case of double standards? Because we hear all the time from the Labour Party that heads must roll if any Conservative is seen to have performed any kind of indiscretion. We saw it with parties during COVID, any financial irregularities around donors, and yet now Sir Keir Starmer, I was astonished yesterday, said, I don't need to see the detail of what happened to Angela Rayner. This is the guy who used to be in charge of the CPS. They seem to believe, I think, that they can just brush it away and it will go away. Will it go away, or will this keep rumbling on?
I don't think it will go away, and that's partly because the Conservative Party obviously sees leverage in this. And I think worth saying too, the amounts are small. I mean, Nadhim Zahawi had to hand back £5 million last year. We're probably talking about £1,500 here. But of course, it does matter because she's housing secretary. She would expect other people to be held to account, and she might well be Deputy Prime Minister in just a few months from now. So sure, the amounts are small, but I think the principle is important. And yes, Sir Keir Starmer, quite canny, I think, in the way he chose to phrase that, in that he said, my team have seen the advice, I don't need to. So being supportive, but slightly hands off, so that if further information should emerge, he'd be able to say, well, I wasn't aware.
Great, so thank you for joining me today. Katherine Forster, have a cracking Easter.